August 9, 1945, 11:02 in the morning, 31,000 feet above Nagasaki, Japan. The altimeter needle held steady at exactly 31,000 as Major Charles "Chuck" Sweeney gripped the yoke of the B-29 superfortress called Boxcar, his knuckles white beneath his flight gloves. Through the plexiglass windscreen, he could see the industrial sprawl of Nagasaki stretched along the western coast of Kyushu, its harbor installations and factory complexes clearly visible despite the morning haze. But this was not supposed to be his target. The primary objective, Kokura Arsenal on the northern coast of Kyushu, had been completely obscured by smoke and clouds from the previous night's conventional bombing raids. 3 separate bombing runs over Kokura had yielded nothing but frustration, and precious fuel burned in futile circles over enemy territory. Now, with fuel gauges showing levels that made even the most optimistic calculations terrifying, and strict orders to avoid radar detection by maintaining course over water rather than land, Sweeney faced a decision that would echo through history. In the specially modified bomb bay behind him, suspended from a single-point release mechanism that had been tested exactly 7 times in the Nevada desert, a plutonium implosion device nicknamed Fat Man waited in its protective cradle. The weapon measured 10 feet 8 inches in length, 5 feet in diameter, and weighed exactly 10,800 pounds. Its polished steel casing concealed the most sophisticated piece of engineering ever created by human hands. A sphere of plutonium surrounded by precisely shaped explosive lenses that would compress the fissile material to critical density in microseconds. Fat Man represented not just 3 years of the Manhattan Project's most secret scientific endeavor, but the combined intellectual efforts of more than 130,000 workers across 37 installations in 13 states. The weapon contained 6.2 kilograms of plutonium-239, produced in massive reactors at Hanford, Washington, where Columbia River water cooled uranium slugs as they transmuted into the element that would change warfare forever. The implosion design had required solving mathematical problems that had never been attempted, engineering challenges that pushed metallurgy and chemistry beyond known limits, and manufacturing tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. But this mission, designated Special Bombing Mission No. 16 by the 309th Composite Group, had already deviated from every carefully planned detail. The pre-dawn rendezvous with escort aircraft over Yakushima had failed when one of 3 observation planes never appeared at the designated coordinates. The primary target approach had been frustrated by weather conditions that made visual bombing impossible. Fuel consumption had exceeded all projections due to extended maneuvering and the weight of the atomic device. Radio silence protocols, established to prevent Japanese interceptors from tracking the formation, had been broken multiple times as crews struggled to coordinate the deteriorating mission. Flight Engineer Master Sergeant John Kuharek had been calling out fuel readings every 15 minutes, each report more ominous than the last. The malfunctioning fuel transfer pump discovered during pre-flight inspection had eliminated access to 600 gallons in the reserve tank, reducing Boxcar's effective range by exactly 213 miles. Every gallon burned over Kokura was a gallon that would not be available for the 900-mile flight back to Tinian. Every minute of delay increased the probability that this $10 million weapon would have to be jettisoned into the Pacific to lighten the aircraft for a desperate attempt to reach emergency landing fields. Everything that could go wrong had gone wrong, yet Sweeney pressed forward toward the secondary target with the methodical determination that had earned him promotion to major at age 25. Navigation charts spread across his lap showed the exact coordinates of the Mitsubishi Steel and Arms Works in Nagasaki's Urakami Valley, the alternative target that planners had designated if Kokura proved unsuitable. Bombardier Captain Kermit Bayehan, crouched over the Norden bomb site in the aircraft's transparent nose, searched through scattered clouds for the visual reference points that would allow precise delivery of the atomic weapon. At exactly 11:02 and 14 seconds, as Boxcar passed over the Urakami River at an indicated airspeed of 285 miles per hour, Bayehan pressed the bomb release switch. The single-point mechanism functioned exactly as designed. Fat Man dropped away from Boxcar's belly, its stabilizing fins deploying automatically as the weapon began its 43-second fall toward the largest Catholic church in Asia and the industrial complex that surrounded it. 43 seconds later, at precisely 11:02 and 57 seconds, the second atomic weapon ever used in warfare detonated exactly 503 meters above the Urakami Valley. The plutonium implosion device functioned with mathematical precision, compressing its fissile core to supercritical density and releasing energy equivalent to 22,000 tons of TNT in a process that converted matter directly into energy according to Einstein's equation E equals mc squared. The fireball reached temperatures of several million degrees Fahrenheit, hotter than the surface of the sun, and generated blast pressures that exceeded 15 pounds per square inch at distances of more than a mile from ground zero. The explosion vaporized everything within a radius of 500 meters, created a mushroom cloud that climbed to 40,000 feet within 10 minutes, and fundamentally altered the strategic balance of World War II. Japan's surrender, announced 6 days later by Emperor Hirohito himself, would cite the enemy's use of a new and most cruel bomb as a decisive factor in the decision to capitulate without the invasion that military planners estimated would cost between 250,000 and 1 million American casualties. But the mission that changed the course of human history began not with scientific triumph or military precision, but with a cascade of mechanical failures, tactical complications, and command decisions that brought the most important bombing operation of the 20th century within minutes of complete failure. The story of how Fat Man reached its target despite systematic breakdown reveals the razor-thin margin between victory and catastrophe that defined not only the final days of the Pacific War, but the entire atomic age that followed. To understand why everything went wrong over Japan on August 9, 1945, and why those failures nearly changed the course of history, you must first understand what this mission was supposed to accomplish and why the Manhattan Project had reached such a critical juncture that immediate action was demanded, regardless of weather conditions, mechanical failures, or tactical complications that would have grounded any conventional bombing operation. The roots of Special Bombing Mission. Number 16 traced back to December 7, 1941, when Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor and thrust America into a global conflict that would ultimately consume more than 70 million lives. But the immediate catalyst for the Nagasaki mission had occurred exactly 72 hours earlier, at 8:15 in the morning on August 6, when Colonel Paul Tibbets piloted the B-29 Enola Gay over Hiroshima and dropped Little Boy, the first atomic weapon ever used against a human target. Little Boy had functioned exactly as the scientists at Los Alamos had predicted. The uranium gun-type device detonated at exactly the planned altitude of 1,960 feet above the Aoi Bridge, creating a fireball that reached temperatures of several million degrees and generating blast effects that flattened nearly 5 square miles of urban Hiroshima. Approximately 70,000 people died in the initial explosion and firestorm, with radiation effects that would claim tens of thousands more in the months and years that followed. The world had entered the atomic age in a blinding flash that could be seen from more than 100 miles away. But 3 days after Hiroshima, Japan had not surrendered. Emperor Hirohito remained silent. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki's government continued to function. Japanese military forces showed no signs of laying down their arms. Intelligence intercepts revealed that Japanese leaders were still debating whether the Hiroshima weapon represented a one-time scientific demonstration or the beginning of sustained atomic bombardment that could destroy every major city in Japan. President Harry S. Truman, who had learned of the Manhattan Project's existence only after Franklin Roosevelt's death in April, faced an agonizing decision that would define his presidency and America's role in the post-war world. Military planners had completed detailed studies for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan scheduled to begin on November 1, 1945. Operation Olympic, the assault on Kyushu, would involve 766,000 assault troops hitting 45 separate beaches in the largest amphibious operation ever attempted. Operation Coronet, the follow-up invasion of Honshu and the Tokyo Plain, would require an additional 1,000,000 men and was projected to continue well into 1946. The casualty estimates made sobering reading in the Pentagon's classified planning documents. General Douglas MacArthur's staff projected American casualties of between 250,000 and 400,000 for the Kyushu operation alone. Adding the invasion of Honshu pushed estimates toward 1,000,000 American casualties, with Japanese military and civilian losses potentially reaching 10,000,000. Recent experience on Okinawa, where Japanese forces had inflicted 26,000 American casualties while fighting to the death despite hopeless odds, suggested that defending their homeland would inspire even more fanatical resistance. Secretary of War Henry Stimson, one of the few officials who had been fully briefed on the atomic program since its inception, argued forcefully that continued atomic bombing offered the only alternative to an invasion that would dwarf D-Day in scope and casualties. But the Manhattan Project possessed only 2 operational atomic weapons in early August 1945. Little Boy had been expended over Hiroshima. Fat Man represented the entire remaining nuclear arsenal of the United States. The production schedules at Los Alamos told a stark story about America's atomic capabilities. The uranium enrichment facilities at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, could produce enough weapons-grade uranium for approximately 1 Little Boy device every 6 months. The plutonium production reactors at Hanford, Washington, operating at maximum capacity, could generate enough fissile material for 1 Fat Man device every month, assuming the complex implosion assembly process functioned reliably. But even at peak production rates, the United States would not possess a substantial atomic arsenal until well into 1946. General Leslie Groves, the hard-driving military director of the Manhattan Project, who had overseen construction of 37 secret installations employing more than 130,000 workers, understood that psychological impact required demonstrating America's ability to continue atomic attacks indefinitely. A single atomic bombing might be dismissed by Japanese leaders as a one-time scientific achievement that could not be repeated quickly. 2 atomic bombings within days would suggest unlimited atomic capability and force Japan to confront the reality of continued atomic destruction until surrender. The scientific and military leadership gathered in the Pentagon on August 7th to debate the timing of the second atomic mission understood that they were gambling with the entire future of the Pacific War. Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer, scientific director of the Los Alamos laboratory where both atomic weapons had been designed and assembled, supported immediate deployment of Fat Man while Japanese leadership was still reeling from the psychological shock of Hiroshima. Delaying the second bombing might allow Japan to recover psychologically and possibly mobilize international pressure for a negotiated peace that preserved the imperial system. Weather forecasts from the Pacific Fleet's Meteorological Service added urgency to the decision. Typhoon conditions were developing across the western Pacific, with cloud cover and high winds that would make atomic bombing impossible for at least a week after August 9th. The weather window for visual bombing, essential for precise delivery of atomic weapons, was closing rapidly. If Fat Man was not delivered on August 9th, the mission might have to be postponed until mid-August or later. Intelligence reports from ultra-code-breaking operations revealed that Japanese leaders were already beginning to adapt to the atomic threat. Industrial facilities were being dispersed from major cities. Government functions were being relocated to underground installations. Civilian populations in potential target cities were being evacuated to rural areas. Every day of delay reduced the psychological and strategic impact of atomic bombing, while allowing Japan to minimize future damage from nuclear attacks. The decision was finalized during a meeting in Secretary Stimson's office on the evening of August 7th. Fat Man would be delivered on August 9th, 1945, regardless of tactical complications. The weapon was too important, the strategic window too narrow, the stakes too high for delay. But the mission assigned to deliver this decisive blow was fraught with problems that began during the planning phase and would multiply exponentially once the aircraft left the ground. On August 6, 1945, Colonel Paul Tibbets had piloted the Enola Gay over Hiroshima, delivering Little Boy, the first atomic weapon used in warfare. The uranium gun-type bomb had functioned exactly as designed, destroying 4 square miles of the city center and killing approximately 70,000 people instantly. But 3 days later, Japan had not surrendered. President Harry Truman and his advisors faced an agonizing decision. Intelligence estimates suggested that Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, would cost between 250,000 and 1 million American casualties. Japanese resistance on Okinawa had demonstrated the fanatical determination with which enemy forces would defend their homeland. Every day the war continued meant thousands more casualties on both sides. The Manhattan Project had produced only 2 operational atomic weapons by early August 1945. Little Boy had been expended over Hiroshima. Fat Man represented the entire remaining nuclear arsenal of the United States. If this second weapon failed to convince Japan to surrender, months would pass before additional plutonium devices could be manufactured and deployed. General Leslie Groves, military director of the Manhattan Project, understood that psychological impact required demonstrating America's ability to continue atomic attacks. A single atomic bombing might be dismissed as a one-time scientific achievement. 2 bombings within days would suggest unlimited atomic capability, even though the United States possessed no additional weapons ready for immediate use. Weather forecasts indicated that August 9th offered the last clear window for several days. Typhoons and cloud cover would make atomic bombing impossible for at least a week after August 9th. Delaying the mission risked allowing Japan to recover psychologically from Hiroshima and possibly mobilize international pressure for a negotiated peace that might preserve the imperial system and avoid complete surrender. The decision was made. Fat Man would be delivered on August 9th, regardless of tactical complications. The weapon was too important, the window too narrow, the stakes too high for delay. But the mission assigned to deliver this decisive blow was fraught with problems from the moment planning began. Major Charles Donald Sweeney, the 25-year-old pilot selected to command this most critical mission, had never intended to become the second person in history to deliver an atomic weapon. Born in Lowell, Massachusetts on December 27, 1919, Sweeney had enlisted in the Army Air Corps in 1941, with dreams of flying fighter aircraft in the European theater. His path to atomic warfare began with disappointing assignment to heavy bomber training, flying the massive B-24 Liberators that he initially considered trucks with wings rather than real aircraft. But Sweeney's exceptional performance during bomber training caught the attention of Colonel Paul Tibbets, who was secretly recruiting aircrew for a classified mission that could not be discussed even within military channels. In September 1944, Sweeney received orders to report to Wendover Field, Utah, for assignment to the 309 Composite Group, a unit that officially did not exist, and whose mission remained classified at levels above top secret. Only after arriving at Wendover did Sweeney learn that he would be training to deliver weapons so secret that even their existence was known to fewer than a dozen people outside the Manhattan Project. The selection criteria for atomic bombing crews reflected the unique requirements of missions that could not be practiced, rehearsed, or discussed with anyone lacking the highest security clearances. Tibbets needed pilots with exceptional technical skills, unshakable nerves under pressure, and absolute reliability in following orders that might seem inexplicable. More importantly, he needed men who could be trusted with secrets that could change the outcome of the war if they fell into enemy hands. Sweeney's crew had been assembled through an equally meticulous selection process. Captain Kermit Bayhan, the bombardier whose precision would determine whether Fat Man struck its intended target or fell harmlessly into Nagasaki Bay, had trained on the ultra-secret Norden bomb site for 18 months before being cleared for atomic missions. The Norden site, itself a classified technology that enemy agents had repeatedly attempted to steal, could theoretically place bombs within a 50-foot circle from altitudes above 30,000 feet. But atomic weapons required even greater precision due to their massive destructive effects and the political implications of missing designated military targets. Navigator Captain Charles Donald, responsible for guiding Boxcar across 2,000 miles of Pacific Ocean to a target the size of a city block, had completed advanced celestial navigation training that qualified him to find pinpoint locations using only star positions and dead reckoning calculations. Radio operator Technical Sergeant Abe Spitzer had been selected for his ability to maintain communication security while operating the complex radio equipment that linked the atomic mission to strategic command authorities in Washington. Each crew member had undergone background investigations that traced their associations back to childhood, and psychological evaluations designed to identify any weaknesses that might compromise mission security. But perhaps the most critical crew member for the success of Special Bombing Mission No. 16 was Flight Engineer Master Sergeant John Kuharek, whose intimate knowledge of B-29 fuel systems would prove essential when Boxcar's mechanical problems threatened to force mission cancellation. Kuharek had accumulated more than 800 hours of flight time in B-29 aircraft, including combat missions over Japan where fuel management meant the difference between returning safely to base and ditching in the Pacific Ocean. His ability to squeeze maximum range from every gallon of aviation fuel would become crucial when the mission's multiple complications pushed Boxcar's fuel consumption beyond all safety margins. The aircraft assigned to carry Fat Man presented its own constellation of technical challenges that began during the planning phase and would multiply dangerously once the mission was airborne. Boxcar, tail number 44-27297, was a silver plate modification B-29, one of only 65 aircraft specially configured for atomic weapons delivery. The Silverplate program had stripped away defensive armament except for tail guns, replaced the standard bomb bay with a single-point suspension system capable of carrying 10,000-pound weapons, and installed specialized fuel injection systems designed to provide maximum range with minimum crew. The most significant modification involved the fuel system that would prove so problematic during the August 9th mission. Standard B-29 aircraft carried fuel in 14 separate tanks, distributed throughout the wings and fuselage, with complex transfer pumps that moved fuel forward as it was consumed to maintain proper weight distribution. The Silverplate modifications had altered this system to accommodate the massive weight of atomic weapons, but the changes introduced new points of failure that had not been fully tested under combat conditions. The discovery of the malfunctioning fuel transfer pump during pre-flight inspection on August 8th created a crisis that reached the highest levels of military command. The pump connected Boxcar's reserve tank to the main fuel distribution system, and its failure meant that 600 gallons of aviation fuel would be inaccessible during flight. This reduced the aircraft's effective range from approximately 3,400 miles to roughly 3,100 miles, cutting the safety margin for the round-trip mission to Japan almost to zero. Flight engineer Kuharek's calculations made sobering reading when he briefed Major Sweeney on the fuel situation. The flight to Japan and return to Tinian would cover approximately 3,000 miles under optimal conditions. But optimal conditions included direct routing, no combat maneuvering, no weather delays, and perfect fuel consumption rates that assumed everything would function exactly as designed. The slightest deviation from the flight plan, any unexpected fuel consumption, or combat damage to the fuel system would leave Boxcar stranded somewhere over the Pacific Ocean with a $10 million atomic weapon in its bomb bay. General Curtis LeMay, commanding the 21st Bomber Command and ultimately responsible for all B-29 operations in the Pacific, faced a decision that encapsulated the enormous pressures surrounding the atomic program. Delaying the mission until Boxcar's fuel pump could be repaired might mean postponing atomic bombing for a week or more due to weather conditions. Intelligence reports suggested that Japanese forces were already beginning to adapt to atomic threats by dispersing critical facilities and evacuating urban populations. Every day of delay reduced the psychological impact that might convince Japan to surrender without the costly invasion planned for November. But proceeding with a mechanically compromised aircraft carrying the only remaining atomic weapon in the American arsenal represented an enormous gamble with potential consequences that reached far beyond military strategy. If Boxcar was forced to jettison Fat Man over the Pacific to lighten the aircraft for an emergency landing, the Manhattan Project would be left with no operational atomic weapons until new devices could be manufactured and assembled, a process that might take months. Without the threat of continued atomic bombing, Japan might continue fighting until the planned invasion, resulting in casualties that could dwarf the destruction already caused by 2 years of strategic bombing. The decision was made at the highest levels of command. Fat Man would be delivered on schedule despite the fuel system malfunction. If Boxcar ran short of fuel during the return flight, rescue operations could be organized using the extensive network of American bases and naval vessels scattered across the Pacific. The strategic importance of demonstrating continued atomic capability outweighed the tactical risks associated with operating a mechanically compromised aircraft over enemy territory. But as ground crews worked through the night of August 8 to load Fat Man into Boxcar's specially modified bomb bay, weather reports from reconnaissance aircraft over Japan indicated that mechanical problems were only the beginning of the complications that would threaten Special Bombing Mission No. 16. Cloud cover was building over both primary and secondary targets. Visibility conditions were deteriorating. The weather window that had seemed adequate during mission planning was closing more rapidly than meteorological forecasts had predicted. At 02:47 on the morning of August 9, 1945, Major Sweeney advanced the throttles on Boxcar's 4 Wright R-3350-23 Cyclone engines to takeoff power. Each engine produced 2,200 horsepower when functioning optimally, but the additional weight of Fat Man pushed the aircraft to its absolute performance limits. The bomb alone weighed more than a fully loaded fighter aircraft, and combined with maximum fuel load, crew equipment, and scientific instruments, Boxcar was operating at the edge of aerodynamic possibility. Tinian's Northfield runway stretched 8,500 feet across the Coral Atoll, barely adequate for the massive B-29 when loaded to capacity. Sweeney needed every foot of concrete to achieve the 150 miles per hour required for takeoff. The aircraft accelerated slowly in the humid Pacific air, engines straining against the massive weight. Airspeed indicators climbed gradually, 60 miles per hour, 80, 100. At 130 miles per hour, still 200 feet from the end of the runway, Sweeney pulled back on the yoke and felt Boxcar reluctantly lift off from Tinian. The climb to cruising altitude became a test of both aircraft performance and crew endurance. Fully loaded B-29 aircraft normally climbed at approximately 500 feet per minute, but Fat Man's weight reduced this to barely 300 feet per minute. Reaching the operational altitude of 31,000 feet required nearly 2 hours of steady climbing, during which the engines consumed fuel at rates that made every minute expensive in terms of range and safety margins. Flight engineer Kuharek monitored engine temperatures and fuel flow rates with obsessive attention to detail. The Wright Cyclone engines were notorious for overheating under heavy load, and cylinder head temperatures climbed steadily during the extended climb. Oil pressure readings fluctuated as the engines worked harder than their designers had intended. Fuel consumption exceeded normal rates by nearly 20%, eating into the already reduced reserves caused by the malfunctioning transfer pump. Navigator Captain Donald worked continuously with celestial navigation equipment, taking star shots through the aircraft's astrodome to establish precise position fixes. The route to Japan required flying along the international dateline to avoid Japanese-held islands where radar installations might detect the formation and vector interceptor aircraft toward the atomic mission. Any navigation errors that forced course corrections would consume additional fuel, while potentially exposing the aircraft to enemy detection. The mission profile called for a complex rendezvous procedure designed to provide scientific observation and photographic documentation of the atomic explosion. 2 additional B-29 aircraft would join Boxcar over Yakushima, a small island approximately 50 miles south of Kyushu. The Great Artiste, Sweeney's regular aircraft now piloted by Captain Frederick Bach, carried scientific instruments developed by Los Alamos physicists to measure blast effects, radiation levels, and atmospheric conditions during the atomic detonation. Big Stink, a photographic reconnaissance aircraft piloted by Major James Hopkins, would document the explosion with specialized cameras capable of recording the atomic fireball's development frame by frame. But the rendezvous procedure that looked straightforward on paper proved problematic in execution. Weather conditions over the western Pacific had deteriorated since the mission planning briefing, with scattered clouds and variable winds that affected aircraft navigation and timing. Radio silence protocols, designed to prevent Japanese interceptors from tracking the formation, meant that the 3 aircraft could not communicate to coordinate their approach to the rendezvous point. At 0900 hours, as Boxcar approached the designated coordinates over Yakushima, Captain Donald reported that they had arrived exactly on schedule, despite the challenging navigation conditions. The Great Artiste was already circling at the predetermined altitude of 30,000 feet, its crew maintaining strict radio silence while waiting for the atomic mission to proceed. But Major Hopkins and Big Stink were nowhere to be seen. Sweeney faced his first critical decision of the mission. Standing orders from General LeMay specified that atomic bombing should proceed only with full scientific observation and photographic documentation. The data collected by instruments aboard the observation aircraft was considered essential for future weapon development and strategic assessment of atomic effects. Los Alamos scientists had argued that without complete documentation, the atomic bombing might fail to provide the technical information needed to improve future weapons or assess their strategic impact. But Big Stink had simply failed to appear at the rendezvous coordinates. Whether due to mechanical problems, navigation errors, or radio malfunction, Major Hopkins and his crew were not where they were supposed to be. Every minute of waiting consumed precious fuel while potentially exposing the formation to Japanese radar detection. The closest enemy radar installations on Kyushu were approximately 100 miles away, well within detection range of B-29 aircraft flying at high altitude. Flight engineer Kuharek's fuel calculations added urgency to the decision. Each minute of circling over Yakushima consumed approximately 60 gallons of fuel, equivalent to nearly 20 miles of range during the return flight to Tinian. The original mission plan had allocated 15 minutes for rendezvous operations, but that time limit assumed that all 3 aircraft would arrive simultaneously. Extending the wait beyond 30 minutes would push fuel consumption into the danger zone, where even minor complications could leave Boxcar unable to reach friendly territory. Radio operator Spitzer monitored emergency frequencies for any transmission from Big Stink that might explain the delay, but military communication protocols prohibited breaking radio silence except in dire emergencies. The formation had to assume that Hopkins was experiencing problems but could not risk exposing their position by attempting radio contact. Japanese monitoring stations throughout the western Pacific were constantly searching for American radio transmissions that might reveal bomber formations approaching their territory. At 0930, with fuel consumption approaching critical levels and no sign of the missing observation aircraft, Sweeney made the command decision that would define the remainder of the mission. Orders or no orders, scientific documentation or not, Boxcar and the Great Artiste would proceed to the primary target without Big Stink. The strategic importance of delivering Fat Man on schedule outweighed the scientific value of complete photographic documentation. The 2 aircraft formation turned northwest toward Kokura, leaving the rendezvous point where they had waited 30 minutes for an aircraft that never appeared. Later investigation would reveal that Major Hopkins had experienced navigation problems that placed Big Stink approximately 50 miles from the correct coordinates, close enough to detect the other aircraft on radar, but too far away for visual contact. Hopkins had been circling in the wrong location while Sweeney and Bach waited at the predetermined rendezvous point. But as Boxcar and the great artiste flew toward Japan's home islands, neither crew knew what had happened to their missing wingman. They knew only that the mission was already deviating from carefully planned procedures and that fuel margins were becoming critically tight. The primary target approach would require precise execution with no margin for error if the aircraft were to complete their mission and return safely to base. The formation turned northwest toward Kokura, the primary target for Fat Man. Located on the northern coast of Kyushu, Kokura housed the Kokura Arsenal, one of Japan's largest weapons manufacturing facilities. The arsenal produced everything from rifles to artillery shells, making it a legitimate military target with significant strategic value. More importantly, from the Manhattan Project's perspective, Kokura was large enough and distinctive enough to ensure accurate delivery of the atomic weapon. But as Boxcar approached Kokura at 10:45, Captain Behan reported through the intercom that the target was completely obscured by smoke and haze. Fires from the previous night's conventional bombing raid on nearby Yawata had created a thick smoke screen that made visual bombing impossible. The Norden bomb site, essential for precision delivery of atomic weapons, could not acquire the designated aiming point through the smoky conditions. Orders for the mission were explicit on this point. Atomic weapons were too valuable and too dangerous to drop using radar bombing techniques. Visual confirmation of the target was mandatory. If the bombardier could not see the aiming point clearly through the bomb site, the weapon could not be released. These restrictions existed not only to ensure accuracy, but to prevent the atomic bomb from detonating over unintended targets, including civilian areas or prisoner of war camps. Sweeney ordered 3 separate bombing runs over Kokura, hoping that winds might clear the smoke enough for visual targeting. Each approach consumed precious fuel and time, while exposing Boxcar to Japanese anti-aircraft fire and fighter interception. By the third pass, fuel levels had dropped to the point where the mission's survival depended on finding an alternative target immediately. The briefing for August 9th had identified Nagasaki as the secondary target if Kokura proved unsuitable for atomic bombing. Located on the western coast of Kyushu, Nagasaki was a major port city and industrial center with significant military production facilities. The Mitsubishi Steel and Arms Works occupied a large area of the Urakami Valley, producing torpedoes, naval artillery, and other weapons for the Imperial Japanese Navy. But Nagasaki presented tactical challenges that made it a less desirable target than Kokura. The city's topography included hills and valleys that could limit the atomic blast's effectiveness. Moreover, Nagasaki's position on the coast meant that navigational errors could result in the atomic weapon detonating over water, wasting the device entirely. As Boxcar turned southwest toward Nagasaki, Master Sergeant Kuharek delivered sobering news about fuel consumption. The aircraft had burned significantly more fuel than planned due to the extended rendezvous over Yakushima and multiple approaches to Kokura. Fuel remaining was barely sufficient for the flight back to Tinian under optimal conditions. Any combat maneuvering, weather delays, or navigational errors would leave Boxcar short of fuel somewhere over the Pacific Ocean. At 1100 hours, Boxcar approached Nagasaki to find the secondary target also obscured by clouds. Captain Behan stared through the Norden bomb site at solid cloud cover that completely blocked visual contact with the ground. The same weather conditions that had frustrated the attack on Kokura were now threatening to force cancellation of the entire mission. Fuel levels had reached the point where immediate action was essential. Sweeney could not afford multiple approaches to Nagasaki, as he had attempted at Kokura. If the bombardier could not acquire a visual target within the next few minutes, the mission would have to be aborted. Fat Man would be jettisoned into the Pacific Ocean to lighten the aircraft for the desperate flight back to base. This was the moment that decades of scientific research, billions of dollars in development costs, and the potential end of World War II came down to the skills and decisions of a handful of men in an overloaded bomber running out of fuel over enemy territory. At 11:01, as Boxcar made what would be its final approach to Nagasaki, Captain Behan suddenly called out through the intercom. A break in the clouds had revealed the city below. Through a gap in the cloud cover, Behan could see the Urakami Valley and the Mitsubishi Industrial Complex. The target was not the exact aiming point specified in the briefing, but it was a legitimate military target clearly visible through the bomb site. At 11:02, he released Fat Man over Nagasaki. 43 seconds later, at an altitude of 503 meters above the Urakami Valley, Fat Man detonated with the force of 22,000 tons of TNT. The plutonium implosion device functioned exactly as designed, creating a fireball that reached temperatures of several million degrees and generating blast pressures that flattened buildings within a radius of 1 mile from ground zero. The explosion was visible to Boxcar's crew, even through their protective goggles. Tail Gunner Sergeant Albert DeHart reported seeing a brilliant flash followed by a towering mushroom cloud that climbed rapidly toward the stratosphere. The shock wave caught up with the aircraft several seconds later, buffeting Boxcar with turbulence that tested the structural limits of the B-29. But the crew had no time to contemplate the weapon's effects. Fuel gauges showed critically low levels. The flight back to Tinian would require every gallon of remaining fuel plus favorable winds and optimal aircraft performance. Master Sergeant Kuharek began calculating alternatives. Iwo Jima offered the nearest American airfield, approximately 800 miles southeast of Japan. If Boxcar could not reach Tinian, Iwo Jima represented the difference between survival and ditching in the Pacific Ocean. The flight back to base became a test of endurance for both aircraft and crew. Sweeney reduced power settings to minimize fuel consumption while maintaining just enough airspeed to keep the B-29 aloft. Navigator Captain Donald plotted the most direct course to Tinian, avoiding any deviations that might add miles to the journey. Radio operator Sergeant Abe Spitzer monitored emergency frequencies, ready to broadcast distress calls if the aircraft began running out of fuel. For 3 hours, Boxcar flew southeast across the Pacific, while fuel gauges crept toward empty. The crew maintained strict silence except for essential communications. Every action was calculated to conserve fuel and maintain optimal flight efficiency. As the afternoon wore on, weather conditions deteriorated. Headwinds increased fuel consumption while reducing ground speed. At 14:30 hours, approximately 400 miles from Tinian, Master Sergeant Kuharek reported that fuel levels had dropped below safe minimums. According to his calculations, Boxcar would run out of fuel before reaching North Field. The mission that had succeeded in delivering the second atomic weapon was about to end with the loss of aircraft and crew in the Pacific Ocean. Captain Donald rechecked his navigation and recommended an immediate course change toward Okinawa, which had been captured by American forces 3 months earlier. Okinawa's airfields could accommodate B-29 aircraft and offered the crew's best chance for survival. But reaching even Okinawa would require pushing Boxcar's fuel capacity to the absolute limit. At 15:15 hours, with fuel gauges showing empty and engines beginning to sputter, the island of Okinawa appeared on the horizon. Boxcar had approximately 10 minutes of flight time remaining. Sweeney contacted Yontan Airfield, the closest American base on Okinawa, and declared a fuel emergency. The control tower cleared all traffic and prepared crash rescue equipment for an emergency landing. The approach to Yontan required careful coordination because the runway was designed for fighter aircraft, not heavy bombers. B-29 aircraft had landed at Yontan before, but never under emergency conditions with minimal fuel. Sweeney would have one chance to get the approach right. A missed landing would mean attempting to reach another airfield with engines that might quit at any moment. At 15:25 hours on August 9, 1945, Boxcar touched down at Yontan Airfield with empty fuel tanks. The aircraft had flown for nearly 13 hours and covered approximately 3,400 miles, pushing the B-29 beyond its design specifications. When ground crews checked the fuel system after landing, they found that Boxcar had less than 10 gallons of aviation fuel remaining in her tanks. The mission had succeeded by the narrowest possible margin. Fat Man had been delivered to Nagasaki and had functioned as designed. The aircraft and crew had survived despite fuel shortages, weather problems, mechanical malfunctions, and tactical complications. But the strategic impact of the second atomic bombing would only become clear in the days that followed. Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement on August 15, 1945, cited the enemy's use of a new and most cruel bomb as one of the factors compelling Japan's capitulation. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had convinced Japanese leadership that continued resistance was futile. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, was cancelled. World War II ended without the massive casualties that both sides had anticipated. The mission over Nagasaki represented far more than the successful delivery of a single weapon. It demonstrated America's determination to use atomic weapons until Japan surrendered unconditionally. The psychological impact of 2 atomic bombings within 3 days suggested unlimited atomic capability, even though the United States possessed no additional weapons ready for immediate use. Post-war analysis revealed the strategic significance of the timing. Japanese peace negotiations had been proceeding through diplomatic channels, but these negotiations aimed at preserving the imperial system and avoiding occupation. The atomic bombings eliminated any possibility of a negotiated peace that might have left militaristic elements in power and required a future war to complete Japan's defeat. The technological implications were equally profound. Fat Man represented the culmination of the Manhattan Project's plutonium program, validating the implosion design that would become the standard for nuclear weapons development. The successful detonation over Nagasaki proved that the United States possessed not just one atomic weapon design, but multiple approaches to nuclear warfare. Major Charles Sweeney returned to the United States as one of only 2 pilots ever to deliver atomic weapons in combat. His decision-making under extreme pressure had ensured mission success, despite systematic equipment failures and tactical complications. In the years that followed, he would reflect on the moral complexity of atomic warfare while maintaining that the bombings had saved lives by ending the war quickly. The crew of Boxcar received recognition for their role in ending World War II, but they also carried the psychological burden of participating in history's most destructive bombing mission. Captain Behan, the bombardier who released Fat Man, later described the weight of responsibility that came with targeting civilian areas for atomic attack. The moral questions raised by atomic warfare would influence American foreign policy and military strategy for decades. Boxcar herself was retired from active service and eventually displayed at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. The aircraft stands as a monument to both technological achievement and the terrible destructive power that science had placed in human hands. Visitors can see the bomb bay where Fat Man was carried and the cockpit where Major Sweeney made the decisions that helped end World War II. The mission over Nagasaki marked the last time atomic weapons have been used in warfare. The demonstration of their devastating effects convinced world leaders that nuclear war represented an unacceptable threat to human civilization. The nuclear age that began over Hiroshima and Nagasaki would be defined by deterrence rather than use, by the threat of atomic warfare rather than its reality. But the narrow margin between success and failure that characterized the Nagasaki mission serves as a reminder of how close history came to a different outcome. If Boxcar had run out of fuel over the Pacific, if the clouds had not parted over Nagasaki, if any of a dozen technical failures had proved insurmountable, Fat Man might never have been delivered. Japan might have continued fighting, Operation Downfall might have proceeded, and hundreds of thousands of additional casualties might have resulted. The men who flew Boxcar over Japan on August 9, 1945, could not have known that their mission would end the deadliest conflict in human history. They knew only that they had been assigned to deliver a weapon of unprecedented destructive power, and that everything that could go wrong with their mission had gone wrong. Their perseverance in the face of systematic failure ensured that the atomic bombing proceeded and that Japan faced the reality of continued atomic attacks until surrender. The story of the Nagasaki mission reveals how individual decisions under extreme pressure can influence the course of history. Major Sweeney's choice to proceed without full scientific observation, Captain Behan's ability to find a target through breaking clouds, Master Sergeant Kuharek's fuel management that stretched Boxcar's range beyond design limits, all contributed to a mission outcome that changed the world. 79 years after Fat Man exploded over Nagasaki, the moral and strategic questions raised by atomic warfare continue to influence international relations and shape global security policies. The nuclear age that began with the Manhattan Project has fundamentally altered the nature of warfare, creating weapons so destructive that their primary purpose has become preventing their own use through deterrence theory. The mission that nearly failed over Japan in 1945 established the precedent for nuclear deterrence that has prevented global war for 8 decades while creating a permanent shadow of potential annihilation that defines modern international relations. The aircraft that struggled to reach its target on minimum fuel reserves, carrying a weapon that represented humanity's greatest scientific achievement and most terrible destructive capability, serves as a reminder that historic moments often balance on the edge of catastrophe. The crew that improvised solutions to cascading mechanical failures, navigated through deteriorating weather conditions, and maintained course toward their target despite fuel shortages that threatened their survival, demonstrated the combination of technical skill and personal courage that changed the course of human history. The weapon that ended the deadliest war in human civilization through a controlled release of atomic energy established both the promise and the peril of nuclear technology that continues to shape scientific research and international diplomacy, decades after the mushroom cloud over Nagasaki had dispersed into the atmosphere. Success and failure, victory and defeat, scientific triumph and human tragedy, all separated by margins too small to measure and decisions too critical to second-guess. The mission Japan never saw coming over Nagasaki succeeded because individual human beings, operating under extreme pressure with incomplete information and malfunctioning equipment, made the correct decisions at precisely the right moments, when the margin for error had been reduced to zero, and the consequences of failure would have altered the trajectory of the 20th century. That is how Special Bombing Mission No. 16 succeeded despite everything going wrong, ending World War II through a combination of scientific achievement, individual determination, and the terrible arithmetic of atomic warfare that convinced even the most fanatical enemies that continued resistance had become not just futile, but impossible in the face of weapons that could destroy entire cities in seconds, and would continue to fall until surrender became the only alternative to national annihilation.